Alrighty, so this is a little earlier than I would have wanted to do this, but I didn't really have much going on today, so I'm going to do this review a little early, and I'm going to move okay, there we go. So this week, I'm going to review a movie that I've been really hyped to see thanks to history buffs on YouTube, and you type in history buffs, and you'll see a bunch of reviews for historical movies at, like, this one. So Goodfellas, it's basically a biopic on a mobster by the name of Henry Hill who had a huge rise and fall between the mid 50s and the early 80s as a part of the Lucchese crime family. And we cover Henry's story from being a tough kid on the streets to being a drug addict to where he has to put himself and his wife and family into witness protection in order to avoid getting whacked. And the first thing I want to say about the movie is that before I get into it, this is only the second gangster film I've seen. The first one was Scarface, and I really didn't like that movie because the main character, in my mind, was completely irredeemable after a while. In this movie, yeah, the characters do some horrible things, and it's kind of what I really appreciate about the writing in this. It's kind of like the same thing I could say about Pulp Fiction is that in both cases, Quentin Tarantino and Martin Scorsese and also Nicholas Pileggi, who is one of the writers for Goodfellas, they managed to create sympathetic characters that, even though they're horrible people, that's not in dispute. Even though they're horrible people, you can kind of sympathize with them to an extent. There's some sense of humanity and sympathy from the characters. It's more complex. And Scorsese has said in interviews that he grew up in neighborhoods where there were a lot of mobsters and gang members and stuff like that. So he kind of was able to look at a more sympathetic side rather than the one note assholes who, yeah, we're gonna kill them boys, yeah, we're gonna shoot them down. That was me trying to do a lousy accent from some Italian New Yorker. That watch Ralph the Movie Maker's review of Gotti, then you'll get a much funnier joke at that expense. But and this was actually I don't think I've seen Robert De Niro in any major movies yet. I still, I mean, I'm a huge film guy, and I haven't seen Taxi Driver yet, which is like one of the classics. I kind of feel stupid now, but I I think the main three characters, Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone, played by Ray Liotta, the aforementioned Robert De Niro, and Joe Pesci. They were three great actors. So this was really they did really well together. You kind of tell that there was a sense of camaraderie. There's a sense that they were with each other. Although I think Henry was probably the one who was a little more repulsed by some of the more graphic, fucked up stuff that they ended up doing. Um, and I do feel like I have to talk about Joe Pesci's character a little bit. I will admit, even though he's a horrible person, to me it's kind of funny to see him have those outbursts because it's like he's overcompensating for being a short guy by being super aggressive. And according to the real Henry Hill, Joe Pesci nailed Tommy DeSimone perfectly, except for the fact that Tommy DeSimone was 10 inches taller than Joe Pesci and was quite muscular, apparently. So some of this will be a review, and some of it will be pointing out some things that actually happened in the real story. For one thing, this movie was inspired by a mid 80s novel written by Nicholas Pileggi called Wise Guy, which again was about Henry Hill's story in a crime family. Um, so, from what I've heard and from what I've read, this movie is a very good documentary like film based on what happened because from what I'm hearing, most people can agree that this movie is more than 90% accurate, maybe 85% at the absolute worst, depending on how you view things. Um, but yeah, it is kind of crazy. I think the craziest bit, there are a lot of crazy scenes with Joe Pesci. Like the scene where he flips his lid over being mocked for used to be for being a shoe shiner. This was back in the 60s when 60s and 70s when people could actually get jobs, shining your shoes on the side of a street, which I think that job's pretty much dead now. Um, and I will say this, I think what with Ray Liotta's character, there are some parts of Henry Hill's backstory that they didn't really go into. Like there's a scene where Henry gets, assaulted by his father for avoiding school and just working at the cab stand, which was Henry Hill's gateway into the crime life. The reason why I bring this up is that from according to Nick Hodges from History Buffs, um, and according to what I've read, Henry Hill struggled with ADHD and dyslexia. Unfortunately, in the late 50s, when this is all taking place, those things didn't exist officially. And what I mean by that is that they weren't actual conditions that people had read about and knew about at the time. So, unlike now, where someone like me or someone else that's struggling to get along in school, unlike now where you could get some support and maybe some tutors and people that can kind of work with you and try to see how to help you work out your quirks, the teachers back then just thought that, well, to quote Henry Hill, a fuck up, you know? Yeah, I'll try to stop swearing now. I'm sorry. Anyway. Um, anyway, so that's why Henry Hill turned to the mob, because it was his way out it was his way to make a living. Although, granted, I feel like if he didn't go down that path, he probably would have ended up being some uneducated factory worker if he didn't join the mafia. Anyways, um, but I do think that the writing and the acting is very well done. I mean, these guys they were on top of everything in the script. They knew what they had to do, and I think Robert De Niro's obsessive compulsion for attention to detail that really worked, because he would call the director and he would call Henry Hill repeatedly to get more like little nitpicky insights on how Jimmy Burke would hold a cigarette, how would he squirt out his ketchup from the bottle, some quirky things like that. Um, Another thing that I find really praiseworthy for Goodfellas is that the camera works really good. There's a lot of tracking shots where the camera is following characters and they're going through room after room and places like that. I thought that was really well done. And it's not just one tracking shot. I think there's at least three throughout the entire movie. And the movie itself is 2.5 hours, but it's gonna feel like less than 2 hours, because the story is compelling, the acting is entertaining and engaging, it's fun to watch, even though these characters are horrible people, and it kind of repulses you to a bit. It is a very well done movie. I'm trying to think of what else I could say. There was one other point I really wanted to make. I do think that the scene where Henry is running errands near the end of the movie and he's high on drugs, I really do like how not just the editing, but I kind of like how we're hearing Ray Liotta narrate the character's thought process, and it's getting panicky, manic like. He really is just losing his mind, and it is really kind of interesting. It's very interesting to see that, because okay, I never did drugs, I never will, but as someone who does have bipolar mania, I can relate to having the racing thoughts in your head and then having that really make you act crazy to no extent, you know. Um. Anyway, so I mean, I think it's a great movie. It's not something. It's not something I would rush to see again. I mean, I do give it credit for being very well done, but it's kind of hard for me to watch. I mean, again, I know the characters are likable to an extent where you root for them in some cases, but it's kind of hard for me to completely get behind them because of what they do. You know, I mean, they're mob members. They make money off of breaking the law, so I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to sympathize with that completely. Um, but I do kind of feel like the one, like I said, I may have said this before, but I'll bear it repeating. I do think if they included that Henry was struggling in school and just got mixed up with the wrong crowd, I think that would kind of paint him as a more tragic, sympathetic figure. But then it does kind of help at the end when he does turn his life around in a way and leaves the life for good and starts to act as a witness to bring all the mobsters to justice. And I think it's kind of telling the story about how that kind of life. There is a price to pay for living on the wrong side of the law. You know, and honestly, I'll say this, the language and the violence didn't really bother me as much because it's not really gory. It's just kind of bloody. Um, and I do think that this is probably this is a little bit of an eye opener. I would definitely like to look at some of Martin Scorsese's other movies. I think the three other big ones I'm probably going to tackle at some point this year are Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, and The Last Temptation of Christ. I'm probably going to review The Last Temptation of Christ around Easter because why not? So all in all, I do think that if you want to see Goodfellas, you're not going to be disappointed, but it might be hard to stomach because of how violent these people are. But that they do walk, as I said, they walk that fine line between being awful and somewhat redeemable. And I think that's the kind of balance that great writing and directing can accomplish. So that's all I really have to say. I will do my Eddie Rabbit cover on Monday, and I'm not sure what I'll review next week, but we'll find out. See ya. Oh wait,